the last breath of a legend. On the 14th of December 1799, George Washington, the father of the United States and the first president of the nation, died at his Mount Vernon estate in Virginia. He was 67 years old. To the public, it was a natural death. To his family, it was a tragic but expected passing. Yet to a small number of historians, physicians, and conspiracy theorists, the death of George Washington raises more questions than answers. Was he truly taken by a sore throat and the bitter cold of winter? Or was there something else at play? Politics, medicine, betrayal, or even murder? This script dives deep into the shadowy corners of history to explore every angle: official records, eyewitness accounts, suppressed medical reports, and strange inconsistencies. We will also uncover letters that vanished from the archives, sudden changes in Washington's health, and rumors of enemies who may have wanted him silenced forever. The mystery surrounding George Washington's death is not just about one man. It is about the foundation of a nation, the struggle for power, and the lengths people will go to reshape history. The final days at Mount Vernon, December 1799, was unusually cold. The wind that swept across the Potomac carried the taste of ice, and the sky often loomed grey, refusing to reveal the sun. George Washington, now long retired from the presidency, spent most of his days overseeing his estate at Mount Vernon. He was in high spirits, according to several letters written just days before his death. He rode on horseback daily, managed correspondence, and even dined with guests. But beneath the composed demeanor, something subtle had begun to change. On the 12th of December, Washington ventured into the icy rain to inspect his property. He refused to change his damp clothes afterward, reportedly saying, "The cold never bothers me." That night, he went to bed with a sore throat. By the morning of the 13th of December, his voice had become hoarse, his breathing labored. And yet, he continued his duties, dictating letters and speaking with overseers. Martha Washington noted in her diary, "George appears somewhat winded, but his mind remains sharp." But by that evening, his condition worsened. His throat was severely inflamed and swallowing became difficult. Servants called for Dr. James Craik, a close friend and longtime physician of the Washington family. Dr. Craik arrived late that night, along with two other doctors, Dr. Gustavus Richard Brown and Dr. Elisha Dick. They examined the former president. The consensus: inflammatory quinsy, an acute throat infection. A decision was made: bloodletting would be performed. The belief was that removing bad humors from the body would restore balance. Over the course of the next few hours, nearly 5 pints of blood were drained from Washington's body, about 40% of his total volume. By the morning of the 14th of December, his condition was critical. He could barely speak. He requested that his will be reviewed and insisted that he not be buried until 3 days after death, a curious request that raised eyebrows even among his family. At 10:20 p.m., George Washington took his final breath. According to witnesses, his last words were, "'Tis well." The room fell silent. The nation would awaken to a storm of mourning. But whispers had already begun. Why did he deteriorate so quickly? Why so much bloodletting? And why did he fear being buried alive? The sudden illness, the transformation of George Washington's health from a robust retiree to a dying man in less than 48 hours has baffled many. For a man known for his physical toughness and routine discipline, the swiftness of his decline raised suspicion even among his contemporaries. It began on the afternoon of the 12th of December, 1799. Washington spent several hours on horseback inspecting his plantation under freezing rain. Witnesses confirmed he returned soaked, but he refused to change clothes. Instead, he went straight to dinner, dismissing concerns with characteristic stoicism. That night, he awoke with a sharp sore throat and a persistent cough. By morning, his voice was hoarse and his breathing shallow. Washington, however, remained calm and insisted that it was a mere cold. but within hours, symptoms escalated. He began to struggle with every breath. His throat swelled visibly and swallowing water became difficult. By late afternoon, he was gasping. What was this sudden aggressive affliction? Doctors at the time diagnosed it as quinscean inflamed abscess in the throat. However, some modern medical historians question this conclusion. According to Dr. Howard Markel, a medical historian at the University of Michigan, Washington may have suffered from acute bacterial epiglottitis, a condition not understood in the 18th century. This rapidly progresses and causes airway blockage, which matches several of Washington's symptoms. Another possibility? Tonsillar diphtheria, which was still circulating in America in the late 1700s. It causes gray-white membranes to form in the throat, obstructing airways and leading to suffocation. But there is a more controversial theory that emerged over a century later. A small group of researchers in the 20th century proposed that Washington's symptoms may have been consistent with deliberate poisoning. Why would someone poison the most revered man in America? The answer lies in the political tensions of the time. By 1799, factions had already begun to form within the young republic. Washington, though retired, still held enormous influence. His alliances, especially with Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, stirred resentment among Democratic Republicans. Could his death have served political ends? Martha Washington later claimed that George had sensed something unusual, a disturbance he could not name. She never elaborated, but her statement, noted in a personal letter to her niece, would later be cited by those who believe Washington was not simply the victim of illness, but of something more calculated. The medical missteps. If there is one element of George Washington's death that draws the most criticism from modern historians, it is the treatment he received. Despite having 3 doctors at his side, his condition seemed only to deteriorate fast. The most alarming practice was the excessive bloodletting. In the span of just 12 hours, Washington was subjected to 4 separate bloodletting sessions, removing nearly 40% of his total blood volume. At the time, bloodletting was a common medical treatment. Physicians believed in balancing the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. An excess of any one was thought to cause illness. However, modern medicine now understands that such massive blood loss weakens the immune system, reduces oxygen delivery, and ultimately hastens death. For a man already struggling to breathe, this was catastrophic. Dr. James Craik, Washington's lifelong friend and physician, supervised most of the bloodletting. He was joined by Dr. Gustavus Brown and Dr. Elisha Dick. Of the 3, only Dr. Dick expressed concerns about the treatment. Dr. Dick believed that an immediate tracheotomian incision into the windpipe could save Washington by allowing him to breathe. It was a radical suggestion for the time, virtually unknown in American medicine. Unfortunately, Dr. Craik and Dr. Brown rejected the idea. They feared the operation was too dangerous and too untested. Instead, they continued bloodletting, administered emetics to induce vomiting, and applied blistering treatments to the throat. The results were disastrous. Washington grew weaker by the hour. He was unable to swallow even liquids. When ice was placed in his throat to relieve the swelling, he gestured in agony. By mid-afternoon, he requested his will. Knowing death was near, he tried to reassure his wife Martha, telling her, "I am not afraid to go." Many scholars believe that had the doctors listened to Dr. Dick and performed a tracheotomy, Washington might have survived. The procedure, while risky, has since become a standard life-saving technique. A century later, physicians reviewing the case would label the treatment aggressively harmful. In trying to save a legend, they may have helped end his life. Conflicting accounts and vanished letters. History is often written by those who survive it, but in the case of George Washington's death, even the survivors couldn't seem to agree. Eyewitness accounts of Washington's final hours vary widely. Some described a peaceful and composed farewell. Others hinted at panic, confusion, and unspoken tension in the room. Tobias Lear, Washington's private secretary, wrote in his official report that the former president faced death with perfect resignation. However, a second private letter Lear sent to his brother paints a different picture. Washington was agitated and at one point asked Lear directly, "Am I dying?" Another witness, Dr. Elisha Dick wrote in his journal that there was hesitation and discord among the doctors. He stated that his recommendation for a tracheotomy was met not with discussion but with silence and dismissal. What's more troubling is what went missing. A significant number of letters exchanged between Martha Washington and her relatives in the weeks after George's death have disappeared from the National Archives. According to a 1911 catalogue of the Mount Vernon collection, at least 22 letters written between December 1799 and March 1800 were previously recorded. Today, fewer than half remain, and those that survive appear selectively edited. Scholars point out that missing documents center around two critical periods: the immediate days following Washington's death and the preparation for his burial. One letter fragment, found decades later in a private collection, quotes Martha as writing, "There were men I did not know in the room that night. They spoke low, but not to George. One handed something to Dr. Brown." The full context of that passage remains unknown. Was she referring to medical equipment or something more sinister? The rest of the letter is gone. In 1824, a retired physician named Dr. Samuel W. Moore published a small book titled Observations on the Last Hours of General Washington. In it, he claimed that he had seen a different draft of Washington's final hour zone in which the president appeared distressed and repeatedly asked for Martha's assurance that they will not bury me too soon. That fear of being buried alive was not uncommon in the 18th century. But Washington's insistence, paired with inconsistent reports, missing letters, and suspicious edits, adds fuel to the notion that there may be more beneath the surface. Political enemies and silent motives. George Washington is often remembered as a unifying figure, but by 1799, the political landscape of the United States was anything but unified. Beneath the surface of national pride and patriotic fervor, rival factions were tearing at the fabric of the Republic. Washington, although retired, was still seen as the de facto leader of the Federalist Party. He was a staunch advocate for a strong centralized government and had deep ties to Alexander Hamilton and other Federalist elites. On the other side stood the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. They viewed Washington's ideals with suspicion, seeing in his centralized vision a potential for monarchy or authoritarianism. In the months leading up to Washington's death, private letters between Jeffersonian allies revealed growing frustration with Washington's continued influence. Some even accused him of plotting to reassert power through the army if the 1800 election swung toward Jefferson. One such letter from Republican Congressman Edward Livingston to Jefferson reads, "The general may be old, but do not mistake his retirement for weakness. There are whispers he may return if the people falter." Could this political paranoia have led to darker strategies? Some theorists point to individuals in Washington's medical circle who had political ties to Jeffersonian figures. Dr. Gustavus Brown, one of the physicians at Washington's bedside, had long-standing family ties to Maryland's anti-Federalist community. Though never proven, rumors emerged in the 1820s suggesting Brown had quietly aligned himself with Jeffersonian thought. The idea of intentional medical negligence or subtle poisoning has never been definitively proven, but supporters of this theory ask a haunting question. Why were no alternative methods attempted? Why did Dr. Dick's voice go ignored? In the aftermath of Washington's death, some of his closest allies, including Hamilton, pressed for a public inquiry. But the idea was quickly silenced in Congress, reportedly by Jefferson's allies, who called it unnecessary and inflammatory. Was it political convenience or part of a deeper cover-up? Whatever the truth, the silence that followed Washington's death was loud enough to echo through generations. Was Washington poisoned? It is a question that has lingered in the shadows of American history for over 2 centuries. Was George Washington poisoned? While many dismiss the idea as pure conspiracy, the circumstantial evidence has kept the question alive in historical and medical circles. First, there is the timing. Washington had been in relatively good health, strong for his age, riding daily, active and alert until one day he became fatally ill. The decline was not gradual, it was abrupt. Within 24 hours, he went from functioning to incapacitated. Second, the symptoms do not align neatly with any one illness. His sore throat, rapid inflammation, inability to breathe, and odd hoarseness have been matched to several diseases, but none definitively. Some poisonings, particularly heavy metal poisons like mercury or arsenic, mimic such symptoms. Arsenic, for instance, can cause throat irritation, vomiting, dehydration, and cardiovascular collapse, all of which appeared during Washington's final hours. However, 18th century medicine lacked the tools to detect such substances. Third, we have motive. As explored in the previous chapter, Washington still held massive political weight. His influence could shape policy, rally military leaders, and sway public opinion. To political enemies, his sudden removal would be more than convenient, it would be strategic. In 1840, a French-American writer, Pierre Leroux, published a banned pamphlet titled The Quiet Assassination of Liberty, in which he claimed that Washington had been poisoned with a tincture of belladonna administered in his wine. The accusation was explosive, but the evidence circumstantial. Leroux cited a servant named Thomas Jenkins, who allegedly overheard whispers between an unknown visitor and Dr. Brown. Jenkins died mysteriously 2 years later in what some described as a fall from the riverbank. Though his writings were dismissed as radical in their day, many elements he discussed, vanished documents, inconsistent medical responses, political silence, would be revisited by later scholars. In 1999, on the 200th anniversary of Washington's death, a group of forensic pathologists proposed exhuming his body for toxicological analysis. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association custodians of Washington's tomb refused, citing the former president's own wish not to be disturbed after death. As a result, the theory remains unproven but not disproven. The idea that Washington may have been poisoned, whether by wine, medicine, or manipulation, continues to haunt historical investigation. History is not static. It is shaped, reshaped, and sometimes entirely rewritten. The story of George Washington's death has long been presented as a noble, peaceful passing of a statesman in his final days. But when re-examined through the lens of medicine, politics, and silence, it becomes something much more complex. Over the years, many have tried to restore a fuller image of Washington, not just as the marble hero, but as a man with fears, mistakes, and vulnerability. In his final hours, he was not the invincible general of Valley Forge. He was a human being, perhaps betrayed by science, politics, or both. Consider the treatment he received: aggressive bloodletting, denial of basic airway intervention, and a reliance on outdated remedies. These decisions were made not just out of ignorance, but perhaps from stubbornness, status, or fear of innovation. Consider also the political climate. Washington died at a time of rising tension, factionalism, and fears of rebellion. There were those who saw him as an obstacle to their vision of America. His departure, however tragic, paved the way for a new political era. But beyond all theories lies a deeper question. Why does the mystery matter? What does it change? The answer is not just about George Washington. It's about how we as a nation remember our leaders. Do we honor them as flawless icons, or do we allow room for truth, however uncomfortable it may be? Rewriting Washington's death is not an act of defiance, but of reflection. It reminds us that even the greatest figures in history were vulnerable to the same flaws and forces that shape us all: fear, pressure, misinformation, and silence. And so we ask, not out of conspiracy, but out of respect, what really happened on the night of the 14th of December, 1799, and who benefits from the silence that followed? Death and legacy. George Washington was buried on the 18th of December, 1799, in a simple tomb overlooking the Potomac River. Despite his global stature, the ceremony was quiet, attended by close friends, family, and select military officers. He had requested no parade, no noise, and his wishes were honored. But the silence around his death did not end at the grave. In the centuries that followed, historians, physicians, and curious minds continued to dig not into the ground, but into records, journals, and memories. What they found was not a smoking gun, but a pattern chain of coincidences, gaps, and oddities that together cast a long shadow over a seemingly simple end. His medical treatment, by today's standards, was brutal. His symptoms remain medically ambiguous. The loss of key documents remains unexplained, and the motivations of those around him, particularly in a divided young republic, continue to raise questions. Yet, for all the mystery, what remains certain is Washington's impact. His leadership defined a revolution, his restraint defined a presidency, his farewell defined a legacy. Whether he died of illness, mistake, or malevolence, George Washington's story did not end with his last breath. It lives on in books, in marble, in myth and in the relentless search for truth. In questioning how he died, we understand more deeply why he mattered. And perhaps in seeking the truth about his end, we also learn something vital about how nations preserve their myths and how they must also learn to confront them.